Hi, I'm Nichole Vogelsinger. Today we are going to be working with woven beads. So we're going to be working with beads that are wooden, and then we're weaving them with different threads. So this is something that you could take the finished product and use it in a piece of jewelry, but you know me, it's going to be embroidery. We're going to be adding it to an embroidered hoop like this, and I'm going to show you how to create the beads out of a wooden bead and some thread, and then how we can add them to a piece of embroidery like this. A few embroidery stitches, we're going to work with other beads. It's going to be a lot of fun. So let's get started. So let's talk supplies for making the woven beads. So first of all, you are going to need some wooden beads. For the ones that I made, this was a double strand. You can see I used the beads from this strand. This has wood circles, it has some silver beads, and then in here mixed in are the wooden beads that I used. These are great because the holes are wide enough to get several layers of thread through, and we'll get to that when we start stitching the beads. But something like this, there are also bead strands like this, which will also work. These are slightly smaller, so you can see the wood bead is a lot smaller. If this is your first time working with a woven bead, I would definitely recommend getting a larger size bead. This is a really great starting point for this, and once you've mastered the technique, you can definitely move on to smaller beads. So that's what you're going to need first, some wooden beads. The needles that I'm using are tapestry needles because this is a woven project. You don't want needles that are super sharp that will be catching your threads. So that's why I recommend a tapestry needle. You'll just need some embroidery scissors or, craft scissors. And then these are the 3 threads that I've used. So this is an eleganza. It's a size 5 pearl cotton. Then I have 2 needlepoint threads. So these are just, if you're a knitter or you are a crocheter, these are just a fingering weight yarn. They're pretty thin. These are the koigu. They're hand painted yarns that are really pretty. I just have 2 little skeins that I've wound into balls. So you can use thicker threads with this project, and as we look at these when we get started, I'll show you why the thicker the thread, the better the turnout will be. So gather your supplies together and let's get to weaving these wooden beads. So I'm first going to start just by cutting this strand apart and pulling off the wooden beads that I am going to use, and then I'm just going to put the rest in a little container that I can use for later. Okay, so I have 3 nice sized wooden beads. For this bead, I've used this eleganza to run my strands through the hole of the bead. And then I used the needlepoint yarn to do the actual weaving. And so when you look really, really close, you can see that there are 2 different color yarns. For this one, I used the same yarn to go through the hole of the bead and then also to do the weaving. And then for this one, this was a thinner thread, and you can see that you can still see a little bit of the wooden bead through the thread of this one. That's why I definitely recommend using a thicker thread, because this is fine. I like this one. I don't mind seeing a little bit of the wooden bead through that, but I do think I prefer this look where it looks just really full, and you don't have to worry about seeing any of the wooden bead. It's kind of like mysterious, like, ooh, what's under that? So you can definitely use a thinner thread, but I wouldn't go any thinner than a size 5 pearl cotton, and that's why I recommend like a yarn. Or if all you have is embroidery thread, then I would go with the thickest pearl cotton, like a size 3. So for my first example, I'm going to show you what it looks like to just use one thread color, because I really do like the look of this. I think it looks kind of cool because it's a variegated thread. I'm also getting a nice variety of colors throughout this. And I think it just has a nice look to it. So now you are gonna want, I'm gonna move the rest of these beads away. You are gonna want a decent amount of thread for this project. Normally, if you watch my embroidery videos, I don't ever recommend starting with this much thread, but it's definitely easier to have more than enough thread than to run out of thread mid-project. So give yourself a nice length of thread. You might have too much, but honestly, I think it's easier to work with too much thread for this project than not have enough thread. And once you have your thread cut, we are going to pull a needle out and thread the needle. The tapestry needles work well also if you're using a thicker thread, because they have a larger eye, and so you shouldn't have quite as much difficulty threading this needle. But one little tip that I have, if you press the thread between your thumb and your index finger and then bring your needle to that, the thread has nowhere to go but through the eye of the needle. So even with thicker threads, it might not be quite that easy, but the thread has to go through the eye of the needle when you work it that way, and so you should be able to easily thread that. Normally when I'm embroidering, I also start by tying a knot at the end of my needle. I am not doing that with this, so I'm just going to take my needle through and then pull all of this thread out. Yes, I've used a lot of thread. And I want to leave a nice little tail at the end, probably about that much. This is going to be what you hold as you secure all of your vertical lines throughout here, but it also just gives you something to hold on to while you're doing the bead weaving. And so now that I have it through the whole of the bead, I'm going to start putting my vertical lines in. My vertical stitches. So I'm going to take the needle up again through this. I'm going to try not to tangle my thread. So just work slowly and carefully and be mindful of your thread at this point. I'm going to be doing an odd number of stitches. This is a woven project, and so for the weaving to work out right, you want it to be an odd number of stitches. So that is my first line. I'm going to keep doing this until I have about 11 stitches on the bead, and this bead can definitely handle your thicker yarn going through like 11 times. I think I could even add an extra 2 on there, get it up to 13. So it all depends on what you want to see as you are working on this. So I'm going to keep going till I have 11 lines on here. So I'm just bringing my 11th stitch through the bead, and I'm just going to pull both ends of this to tighten it. I do want these stitches to be fairly tight. You're going to need to get your needle and thread through them, but you don't want them to be so loose that the weaving doesn't work well. So just, you want to tighten them, and I always give it one more count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Okay, so you definitely want 11 or 13. You want an odd number of stitches. If you have an even amount of stitches here, the weaving will not work as you're going around. Like, you're going to be going over and under, but you need the odd amount of stitches to work as you're going all the way around. And if you notice that it's not working right, you might have miscounted and you might have an even amount of stitches. So now that I'm up near the top and this little tail is the bottom of my bead, I'm just going to be able to start weaving. So my needle and thread are up at the top. I'm going to take my first stitch and I'm just going under one of the stitches. Start wherever you want to. And I'm going to pull the thread all the way through. Having this much thread, this is the most time-consuming part of this process, just keeping an eye on your thread. So I've gone under one stitch. I'm going to go over this one and under this one. And you can kind of, if you can probably make it under 2 stitches, like if you want to skip one and go under the next one, but because the round, like at this end of the bead, it's a little hard to get your needle under there, and you start shifting these lines around, which I don't really want to do for this process. So I'm just taking it 1 stitch at a time. If you've seen me do weaving on fabric with different embroidery stitches, you know it's easy to go under multiple stitches at a time, but because we're working on a round object, it's a little bit different, and you kind of just need to do it like 1 little strand at a time. So I've gone under my first stitch, over my second, under my third, over this one, and now under the next one. So you're just going to keep continuing this way. We're going over and under every stitch. We're going to make it all the way around to the beginning again. And you're just going to keep going with the same exact weaving that you're doing. So I went over, and now I'm going to go under. And you can see what I mean by when I said the thread, pulling the thread through is the most time-consuming part. It gets easier as you go because you've used up some of this thread, so you don't have to worry about pulling it all through as much. Okay, so you can see this, let me pull this thread. This is where I started because I had gone under this one and over this one. So now I'm back around. I've just gone under this stitch, so I'm ready to go over now and then under. And you know that you have the right amount of stitches when it works out like that. If I had gotten all the way around and this stitch, my next move was to go under it, then I would have known that I put the wrong amount of foundation stitches, because you want it to always be the opposite of what you previously did. And so this is the process. Keep going with this. Keep managing your thread. You can continue to, as you work each row, you can push your stitches up towards the top, and that's what keeps the bead from showing through. So you want to press your threads together. One other thing that might happen is your little foundation rows. These rows can move around a little bit. Totally fine. You just move them where you need them to be. You can just push them around as you're working, and keep pushing these stitches up towards the top so that it's completely covering the wooden bead. So I'm just going to keep going with this one. Try not to knot my threads, and I'm going to cover this whole bead with thread. So I'm almost done. You can see I just have a tiny bit of this left. So we're going to finish this up, and then I'm going to show you how we're going to finish off our threads. And at this point, any threads, like any gaps that you have, just push your threads up throughout the bead. It might make more space here at the bottom for you to have to do a little bit more weaving, but I think it's definitely worth it so that you don't see any of the bead through the threads. So just take the time to do that. As you're getting to the very end of this, it can get a little tricky doing your weaving because all of the threads are like really tight together down here, but that's a good thing. So just do your best and try not to leave any gaps in the thread. Okay, so I am looking at this. I'm happy with, I just want to give it one more check to make sure that I don't see the bead showing through. I think it looks really good. So here's how we're going to finish it off. If you have, this is about how much thread I have left now. I'm just going to trim that. And I'm going to tie a knot. So the thread that you just wove and the thread that you began with, I'm going to tie those two together. And you can just, I like to just give it an extra knot just for good measure to make sure it's all secure. And then I like to thread both of these through the needle. And then I like to take them through all the way to the top. It gets your threads in there nice and tight, and you can feel like there is, I grab another needle, and you feel like it's nice and secure that way. That's just a little bit of the bead that came through. Okay, and then you can just trim them off. And you have a bead. If that annoys you, just tuck it down a tiny bit. And there you go. So I'm going to show you one other method of if you want to use two contrasting threads. It's just a slightly different way to start your bead. I won't go through the whole process of weaving it again, but I want to show you how to do it with different threads. So for this method, I'm using the size 5 pearl cotton. That is going to be my foundation stitches that run vertically through the bead. So I'm going to start the same exact way that I did when I was just using one thread color. So I'm going to leave a little tail down here, which gives me a way to hold this in place as I'm adding my stitches. And I'm going to do my 11 stitches through the bead again. All right, so I just want to give it one more double check, make sure that I have 11 stitches. And I do. So I still have my tail at the bottom, but my thread is up at the top because that's how we were working our foundation rows. So I'm just going to make sure that as I take my needle down through the center, I'm not taking it down and undoing a stitch. So I'm kind of making sure that my needle goes through some of those other foundation stitches like that. And I'm just going to make sure that these are all placed right for when I start my weaving. And this is where I like to tie a little knot now before I'm going to cut off these threads. I just want to do a little knot like that. So instead of doing it at the end like I just did, we're just doing that right now at the beginning. And instead of holding on to one thread as you weave your thread through, because you're going to be using a different color, you're just going to be holding on to 2 threads while you weave. And then the end is going to be exactly the same. When you're finished weaving and you have your thread down at the bottom, you're going to tie these 2 together with your weaving thread, tie a little knot, and pull all 3 up to the top of that bead and tuck it down just like we did with this one. So that is how you weave your wooden beads. And now you can use them for anything. You can use them for jewelry, but you know me, and you know how much I love embroidery. So I'm going to show you how to add these to a piece of fabric. So this is the fabric that I'm going to be using. You don't need a large amount of fabric. I'm working with a smaller 5-inch hoop. So you're going to need a fat quarter or less of fabric, just something to fill the hoop and give you a little bit extra around the sides. I picked my thread colors based on my fabric color. So if you are looking to embroider your beads onto fabric, think about that as you're choosing your thread colors. You might want to choose something that matches this. For me, I'm going to be adding these along here where you see the little buds, and so I wanted them to match my fabric. I'm going to be using just a 12 weight cotton thread. Any beading thread will work, and a needle. So first you're going to want to hoop up your fabric. I do have a larger cut of this fabric. It was so pretty. I bought a big piece, but this is just from my stash. And I want to decide the placement of my hoop. And I'm thinking about the beads that I made as I'm deciding what I want to show up in my hoop. So a lot of times before I even cut the fabric, I put the hoop on the fabric just to decide what do I want visually to see the most. This is a really pretty grouping here, but I also like these larger flowers, and I just want to make sure that I can get, I like this because I have a larger flower here, and I still have some of the smaller ones, plus I have lots of these little buds, which I do want to make sure I have the buds. I think when I actually hoop it, I'm going to have the hoop with the top here. So that's the next step. I'll put my fabric inside the hoop and then cut it out of the larger piece of fabric. There's a nice scattering of buds on here. So if I make more than just these 4 beads, there's plenty of places for me to put them. And I did choose a smaller hoop because I want the beads to really stand out. So you can see when I set them on here, they're gonna look really cool. I don't know if this darker purple goes well. I think I might use these more variegated colors, and I'm gonna finish up that other one to add here. I might do 1 or 2 more. So I might have 5 beads total. If I'm adding larger things like this, I always think in terms of like odd numbers. I feel like odd numbers of things just look better visually. That's just me. So I'm going to cut this out and get ready to embroider. I like to leave about this much all the way around. I'd say that's about 2 inches of fabric. You can iron your fabric beforehand if you want. I don't have any creases in mine, and I'm going to be pulling the hoop really tight, which kind of will pull out any wrinkles anyway. So I'm not worried about ironing my fabric first, but that's a step that you can take. And then I like to just tighten my fabric in the hoop before I get started with any embroidery. So now I'm just going to get my 12 weight thread, or your embroidery thread, whatever you want to use. I tie a little knot in the end, and then I'm going to thread my needle. You can also decide if you're going to be embroidering on this fabric, which again, for me, more is more. I love to have a lot of embroidery going on. So I'm probably going to add some stitches throughout here. I'm going to show you 1 or 2 of the stitches that you can add. I would usually add larger pieces towards the end, but I really want to see how these are going to look. And the only reason that I add larger pieces toward the end, it's because as you're embroidering, your thread wants to catch on larger things on your piece. And so that's why I sometimes wait to add like the really large pieces. But right now I really do want to see what other pieces I'm going to want to embroider through here. And so I kind of need these larger pieces to be on the fabric. So I'm going to add them now. And I'm going to add them, the first one I'm going to put right here. So I'm just going to take my needle up through the fabric. And I'm going to grab this little guy. And this, I'm going to just bead it like this is a regular bead, because it is a regular bead, one that I've just made really pretty. I'm going to take my needle and thread through the bead and arrange it on the fabric the way that I want to see it. Now I'm going to hold my thread tight and I'm going to take my needle down through the fabric just like that. Now this is a larger bead. It's not heavy because it's a lightweight wooden bead. The thread that I've woven on has not added much weight at all. But you can see it kind of like wants to wobble around, and I don't want that. So I'm holding my thread nice and tight underneath. I'm going to go through this bead 2 or 3 more times to give it extra security and to make sure that it's not moving around on my fabric. This is a nice thin thread that can definitely go through the whole of the bead. Even though there's lots of other threads going through there, it's not a problem at all. And you can see already just with one other thread going through there, it's not moving around at all. So I think just one more time passing through will give me the security that I need and knowing that it's not going to move around on my fabric. There we have it. And now to secure this bead and make sure that it's on here really good, and I'm going to be moving my thread to go other places, I'm going to take it below the fabric and I'm just tying it off. And I'm actually going through the underside of the woven bead, so that just gives it one more little layer of security. So I'm doing that like 3 more times, and then I'm just going to tie a knot and one more, and then I feel comfortable tying off this thread, cutting it, and moving on to the next spot where I'm going to add my bead. So I'm going to do that to my other beads, and then we'll add a few other embroidery stitches. So here it is with 3 of the beads attached. And I'm actually leaving it this way. Remember I had said I wanted to add probably 5 of them. Well, I covered up the 3 main buds of the trees that are here. And I feel like adding any more might overwhelm this piece because it is smaller. If you're using like a larger hoop or a larger project and you can feel like it's not going to overwhelm it to add more, then go ahead and do that. I'm going to be leaving it at this, and let me show you from the side what it looks like. I absolutely love what these beads add to this piece. I'm also thinking about height of things. So this has added a lot of height to this hoop, you can see from the side. I don't want this to be the only height that's on here. So I'm going to be adding stitches. The stitches will add a little bit, but I'm also going to be focusing on adding some stacks of beads and sequins to just the areas around these beads, the background, because I don't want them to stand out as the only thing with height on the hoop. So think about that also as you work through your project. I'm going to add some bugle beads throughout here. I'll show you how to do that next. And then I'm going to show you a stitch that works really well and is very decorative for little buds like that. Okay, the fun part of looking through all of my beads. So I have, these are the Miyuki Bugles. These are a pretty pale colored like apricot, which you can see is going to go really well with this. And then I have some seed beads. So the colors of my project, there are a lot of like oranges tucked throughout here. I'm not going to make it primarily orange, but I do want to kind of like bring out some of that orange. One of my very favorite colors. These are like the fuchsia pink almost. And then this is a really good one. These are the transparent yellow coral. They are, I'll open it up and show you. These are great because there's two different colors that will kind of go with all of this. So all together, I think this is a great bead palette. So we're gonna add some bugles first. I'm using the same thread to bead all of this that I used for attaching this to the fabric. And I do need a nice thin needle. I have some beading needles here, and I'm gonna probably, for these bugles, need one of the thinnest ones because they're a very thin needle, or they're a very thin bugle. And before I even thread my needle, I just wanna make sure that the bugles pass over, and they do, easily without a problem. So I'm gonna work from the center of this flower, and I'm gonna scatter some of the bugles throughout. And these are gonna be just laying flat on the fabric. So I wanna make sure that it's positioned where I want it. And then I'm just gonna take it back down through the fabric. I'm also not going to add all the bugles first and then come back and add all the Czech seed beads second. I'm going to work on these both throughout this because it's easier to visualize what you're doing when you're working with all of your beads rather than going from one to the other. So that's why I have them all poured out here. And let's see. I want to make sure that I'm following the fabric also. I'm using the fabric as my guide for where to bead. So I'm following these colors and just adding beads as they, you know, as they kind of occur in the fabric. I feel like that's what's going to make it look most natural. And keep the same feeling of the fabric. When I'm beading over fabric, I'm not looking to change the appearance of the fabric. I chose this because I really like the fabric, and so I want to make sure that I still can see the fabric through the beads and still know what I'm looking at when I'm working on this. So you can see I added a few of the seed beads throughout here where the darker colors are. I'm going to keep going with this in the exact same way. I'm just adding single bugles, single beads throughout this. I'm not going to cover the whole flower completely. These are really to accent pieces of the flower. And so I'm just going to keep going with this. So I finished beading this flower. I mixed the bugle beads with the size 8 Czech seed beads. I also put in a few of the size 6 seed beads. And then I added sequins also, 2 of the different colors from the Sequins and Beads Kit. And you can see I mixed in the colors here and just layered them just with tiny stitches to secure them down the same exact way that I added beads to the stitches. So this is the oyster stitch. You can use it for oval shapes like this. You can use it for petals. I like to use it sometimes in place of a lazy daisy shape. So I'm going to bring my needle up at the top of the petal and pull the thread through. And then I'm holding my thread over here. And then I'm going to take my needle down right next to and a tiny bit lower than where I originally came out. So I'm just taking it down there and up at the base of the petal. So you see it's a small area that I'm covering. And then I'm gonna pull my thread through, being mindful of all of the larger pieces that we have on here right now. I'm just pulling it all the way through. And now I'm gonna take my needle and go under this little bar right here that we created. And I'm gonna pull the thread through. I'm not pulling it through super tight. And then I'm gonna take my needle down right where I just pulled my thread through at that same bar. And before I take it all the way through the fabric, I need to secure it. So I'm bringing my needle up at the base again, and that's what's gonna secure this stitch. But I'm gonna show it to you one more time. Actually, I'll do it over here so it's a little easier to see. So now I'm gonna cover this petal right here. So I'm taking my needle up, bringing it through. Gotta adjust my hoop a little bit. When I bring it through that first time, I hold the thread off to the side. And then I take my needle down. So remember, it's not exactly parallel, it's slightly lower than where I first came out. And I'm taking it down through the fabric, and then I'm gonna pull the needle up through the fabric. So before I'm even taking my needle and thread anywhere, it's just this one movement. I'm gonna get it up at the right spot. Okay, just like that. And then I'm gonna make sure that my needle is going through the thread. So as long as you're holding it off to the side like that, it's gonna go the right way. So you see it's kind of made like a little loop with a crossed part at the top. I'm slipping my needle under that little bar at the top and just gently pulling it through. I'm not pulling it super tight because now I need to take my needle down right at that same spot, pull it through, and then before it goes all the way through, I'm just bringing my needle up to secure this. So you see, it's a little reminiscent of a lazy daisy, except it's got more twists going on, which make it a little bit more raised. So you can rewind that and watch that part over and over again to get the stitch down. And really this stitch, a lot of it comes with practicing the stitch. It can be a little bit confusing. So just watch that and rewatch it and give it a try. And soon it will become like second nature and you'll be whipping out oyster stitches as petals all over your project. So I finished adding the oyster stitch there. I put another one up here. And now I have a few other areas where you can tell they're just little like buds, but I want to use some beads here. I've got one spot here. I've got a few little clumps over here and here. And so I want to add, these are the 2-hole Ginkgo beads. These are really, really great when you're working with like a botanical fabric like this, because these you can just tuck in anywhere that you need like a little flower shape or a leaf shape. Let's see, I'm gonna put it like this. And they are a great little accent to embroidery. So I'm gonna be working in this area right here. And you can see when I hold it onto the fabric, like it really is, it's like a perfect match for the little buds. So these are the, let's see, these are the opal rose color. And they're the 2-hole ginkgos. So the way that I add these is I'm just using my beading thread and a thin needle. I'm gonna bring my needle up, not quite in the middle of this shape, because the beads or the holes for this are on either side of this middle part. So once my needle is up, I then just take it through the bead and I'm going to secure one side and then the other side. So I just need to make sure now that the bead is lying on the right part of the shape that I want to cover. And once it's there, I can just pull the thread all the way through. And now I'm going to come up on the other side and find the other hole for this shape. And take the needle through and then pull it down below the fabric again. So it's really simple. It's just like adding a bugle bead or adding a seed bead. It's just fun to play with different shapes in your embroidery. And again, it gives this more dimension because we're working on adding dimension throughout this piece. And so if we're able to add more dimension in the form of shaped beads, I love being able to do that. So I'm going to add some of the ginkgos into all of these remaining sections of the fabric, and then we're going to do a little bead stacking. So we have added dimension with our woven beads. We've added a little bit of detailing throughout this flower. We added dimension with the oyster stitch, which if this is a tricky stitch that you don't feel like trying to master right now, another alternative is the lazy daisy, which would be a great alternative to fill in little areas like this. We added the ginkgo beads along here for more dimension and a little bit of detail. And the final thing we're going to do for this hoop is to add some stacked beads, because holding it from the side, those woven beads are still the most dimensional part of this. And when I'm working on a project like this, I like to have graduated dimension, if that makes sense. So this is the tallest point here. These beads and stitches are all about the same level. So I want something in between that. And the best way to do that is to stack some beads. So I'm going to add this. I'm going to put my hoop into my stand. Now I have 4 different color beads. This is actually a trickier color for me to match with this particular project. It's not quite yellow, it's not quite green or brown. I have these great beads in this color, which kind of match the darker bits of this fabric, and so I'm going to work with those. I've also got some golds throughout here, which are a nice blend, and I've got this really bright gold metallic. So I'm going to start with a mix of these and see what I'm liking and not liking, and I can just change the mix as I'm working on it. So I'm using a variety of size 6 beads and size 8 beads. When I'm doing bead stacking, I like to be able to vary the sizes of the beads. And I think we'll put a few of these in here. So yeah, I've got a nice little variety. I'm going to save the gold metallic because I'm not sure if that's exactly the vibe that I want with this piece. I'm going to add a few stacks and see how I'm liking it. So I'm just going to start right next to one of the woven beads, and I'm going to bring my needle up through the fabric and pull my thread all the way through, just using a beading thread. This is a 12 weight cotton, and I'm going to start by adding 3 of the larger size 6 beads to this, and then on top of that I'm going to add 2 size 8 beads. Now one of those size 8 beads I am holding onto in my hand. I'm going to take my needle through 4 of the beads, so the 5th one I'm holding, and I'm going to take it all the way through. And as I'm pulling my thread through, I'm holding on to this last bead. And you can see, I'm going to take this out and hold it up from the side. I'm right at the same level as that woven bead. So 5 beads are going to give me that height, which means that I'm going to want to vary my stacks of beads as well, because I don't want everything that height. I want a few beads of different sizes. So I'm going to just do 2 beads of the size 6 and 2 of the size 8. Add all of those on there, and remember the very last bead that I put on, that's my anchor bead, and so I'm holding that off to the side as I pull my needle and thread through. And I just like to hold that bead because it helps me to gauge the tension that I need. So now from the side, I've got 2 different heights. This is the tallest, this is slightly lower, and then the lower stack. So that's all I'm gonna do. I am not completely filling this fabric with beads and sequins. I want to still see some of the original pieces of the fabric through all of this. With some pieces, I really like to do that and to see the original fabric. So I might go through and just add little straight stitches, or I might do a little back stitch outline to part of it. But this is the most that I'm going to do in the way of beading, just to get some dimension throughout this piece. And I'm just going to scatter these throughout the rest of the hoop. So I finished adding all the stacks of beads, and you can see when you look at this, you don't notice like lots and lots of beadwork on this one. I really did work to keep it slightly sparse. I mean, for me, this is sparse. For you, it might be just about right. But looking from the side, you can see there are various levels of stacked beads. These woven wooden beads aren't the only thing that are noticeably dimensional on the project, which is what I wanted. I did go through, and after I added the stacks of beads, I found it the perfect sequin color. This middle one right here is like the perfect yellowy gold for this background. And so I just added them just with a little straight stitch. It's really easy to add sequins like that. You can either add them singly or kind of like layer them like I did in the flower. And I just feel like it gives it like a nice finished look when you add some sparkle to it. So then I am also working on adding a little bit of stem stitch. And you can notice I did not stitch every little bit of this fabric. Some projects I do. Some projects, every little bit of everything has been embroidered. This one I really worked, and it was a restraint to myself to keep it a little bit less embroidered this time. But I just want to show you how easy it is to add a little bit of back stitch, or I'm sorry, stem stitch detailing to your project. So you can see I did the little leaves here, just partial leaves. I didn't go through and do the middles or anything. With this flower, I just did a few of the outside petals. I feel like it just gives it a little bit more definition and makes it look like I've finished a project when I add a little bit of that stitching. So for the stem stitch, I'm going to bring my needle up right here. And I'm going to take it down on the line of the flower, the petal. And then the next time I bring my needle up, I'm bringing it up kind of on the background. I'm about halfway in the middle of that stitch that I just stitched, but I'm not bringing it up on the line of the petal. And then as I take it down, I am going onto the petal line. And you can see that working it this way, so when I bring this up, it's coming up on the background fabric color, but down onto the petal. It works really nicely around curves and gives it kind of like a twisted appearance. I'm going to add one more in there just to make it look a little bit thicker right there. This is also a really easy stitch to add a bead if you wanted to. When you bring your needle up, I'm going to start over here. This is when you would add the bead. Now, I'm not adding beads to the petals here because I don't think they need it because I have enough going on. But if I were to add a bead, it would be at this point. I would put the bead on my needle, push it aside, kind of forget about it as I take my first stitch down. And then I would just keep doing the same thing. I would bring my needle up, put another bead on, take it down, and the beads this way would, they fall right on the line of the stitch. So as long as you're keeping your stitches even, your beads will be nice and even. And it's a great stitch to, I always recommend either the stem stitch or the back stitch if you're just getting started adding beads to your embroidery. Those are both really good stitches. So I'm going to finish back stitching or stem stitching just a few of these petals. I might go back in and do a little bit of that, and then we'll finish up the hoop. So my stitching is all done, my beading's all done, and I'm ready to finish this hoop. Look at that sparkle, isn't that pretty? I just love those sequins. So I'm going to give it one final tighten. I like to do that because as you embroider, your project kind of moves around. When you're stitching beads on, it's just natural that it moves around. That's pretty tight in there. I like to give it one more trim. I want to cut enough fabric off that I can fold it over and glue it to the back of the wooden part of the hoop. So I'll show you that. So I'm leaving, it's maybe a ½ inch all the way around. When you look at it from the back, you want to be able to fold it over this part of the hoop and not have it touch the fabric. And then I just take my white school glue and I run a strip of it all the way around the hoop. With a smaller hoop like this, it's easy to do it all in one pass. And then I'm just gonna fold the fabric over the hoop. You can see just with like a light folding like that, it starts to adhere. The fabric starts to adhere to the hoop, but I sometimes go around like this and just give it that little extra help that it needs. When this dries, it's going to harden. The fabric is going to harden onto the hoop, and it really creates like a nice smooth back to the hoop. And then I leave the back of my stitches uncovered. These are the hoop guts that I'm proud of because I spent a long time stitching them. I think they look just as pretty as the front of the hoop. And so I encourage you to embrace the hoop guts in all of its messy imperfections and enjoy that. But if you don't feel like embracing it as much as I do, you can always cover it up. And the simplest way that you can cover it up is to cut a piece of felt. It can just be a craft felt. Cut it the size of your hoop, and you can use pinking shears if you want to give it like a nice zigzag edge, and you can just place it on your hoop. You don't want the edges to extend beyond this, so it can take a little bit of, trimming to get it to exactly the right size, but it will kind of like stick to your stitches, and you don't need to use any glue or anything. You just press it into place, and then you can cover up your stitches if you're gifting it or if you just don't want to see your stitches. So I'm going to let this dry, and then I'm going to hang a ribbon from the top. Your glue doesn't need to dry for long. If you are going to be hanging this on a wall or setting it up against something, I do like to let it dry at least 24 hours just to be really certain that it's not going to get gluey marks on anything. But when it is dry, I just have a piece of rickrack here, and I'm going to slip it through the top of the hardware. And you just decide however long you want your piece to be. And I'm just going to tie a little knot. Trim off the bits that I don't need. I'm not going to throw this away. I use little bits of this in all of my projects, so I have a special bin that little trims go into. So I just tie a knot, and it is ready to hang with other pieces on a gallery wall, or I could set it on a shelf. Just a little reminder of what you can do with some fabric and beads and thread. So I hope you enjoyed this. I hope that you enjoy the weaving these larger beads. And if you don't end up putting it on fabric, I would love to see what you do with your beaded creations. So happy stitching!